Welcome to Attainable Green. I'm Jess, and today we're going to be talking about the Paphiopedilum delenatii. This is a care collab video with Nina of Ninja Orchids and Fernanda Nascimento. We're going to share how we take care of this plant in our respective environments and setups, and hopefully one of them will be similar to you to help you grow this plant better. So let's dive right in. So let's get started with the general environment. I grow the Paphiopedilum delenatii indoors. It's on a west-facing window that gets afternoon light, so it gets about 6 to 8 hours of sunlight, and the rest of the time it's in shade. The temperature differential is not very great because we're indoors, so the coldest it gets indoors is about 55 degrees, and it can get up to about 85 degrees in the summertime. As for humidity, it gets about 40 to 60% humidity, although during the Santa Ana event, our humidity can dip down to almost 10% for a couple of days. As long as I keep the plants well watered during the Santa Ana winds, it shouldn't be a problem. When it comes to watering, I water this plant about once a week, and during the summertime and the hottest times of the year, I can water 2 to 3 times a week, depending on how dry the media can get. I use tap water to water my plants, and that has water parameters between 7 and 8, and a TDS between 200 to 300 ppm. I also use NutriCoat Slow Release Fertilizer, which is 1868, and so far that's been doing quite well. With Paphiopedilums, I hear they're pretty sensitive to salt buildup, so I just make sure to flush these plants regularly so that there is no salt buildup. When it comes to media, this plant is potted in a small bark mix with a little bit of perlite and charcoal. Although this is a fairly well-draining mix, I find that it's easier for me to water these plants more often than to wait for it to dry out because it has so much water in the pot. Some people can grow them in straight sphagnum moss, but I find that this bark mix works better for me. When it comes to repotting, you can repot Paphiopedilums almost any time of the year, although there are several key moments that are probably better, and that is usually when you can see new growth on the root tips, or when there is a new fan that's starting to establish itself and the roots are just emerging. That way, when the new roots are pushing into the media, it gets used to that new setup. As for problems, I actually haven't had very many problems with these plants. For the most part, Paphiopedilums have been fairly easy for me to grow as long as I don't overwater them. So during the winter season, I kind of back off on my watering a little bit and let it dry out a little bit between waterings. And then during the summer season, I just keep it heavily watered and make sure that it doesn't dry out. Also during the summer season, I kind of back off from the light a little bit to give it a little less light, because I notice that as the temperatures get hotter and it's so close to the windowsill, sometimes there can be a little bit of pitting or a little bit of sunburn on the leaves because it just gets too hot. So that's the only thing that I try to keep in mind. So that is kind of the general care about how I take care of this plant, and I'm going to give a little bit of background about its native habitat and kind of how it looks. The Paphiopedilum delenatii is one of the easier species, and not only that, it is also one of the few fragrant Paphiopedilums. It has kind of this light rosy scent that's very pleasant. The Paphiopedilum delenatii was found in Vietnam, and it was mostly grown on these cliffy hillsides with lots of heavy rainfall. They tend to grow in kind of a granite humus layer, so they're considered kind of lithophytes and / terrestrials. This is also a Paphiopedilum that does well in acidic soils, so this plant can actually do well in sphagnum moss, and some people say that they've had a lot of success growing it in moss versus in bark. There are several different color forms of the delenatii. I have the typical form, which is kind of these white petals and sepals with a slight pinkish blush with the darker pink lip. There is an alba form, which is completely white with a yellow staminode in the center. There is a vinicolor form in which the leaves have also kind of a darker red pigmentation on the leaves and on the leaf margins, and the flowers themselves are a lot darker. So the pouch tends to be kind of a dark burgundy type of color, and there is a lot more pink in the petals and sepals. Also, there is considered a semi-alba version, and in that type of plant, the petals and sepals are completely white and the pouch is that burgundy color. Each different variety has its own little quirks, and some people like to collect all of them because it just makes it super interesting. As for the fragrance, it doesn't always come through on each and every plant, and it's kind of random how that appears. So if you really want one that's fragrant, it's either best to go when it's in bloom and pick up the one that's fragrant, or even ask the seller to try to select one that is known to be fragrant. This plant has one flower that can be in bloom, but some are also known to have 2 flowers in bloom at the same spike. And in special cases, I think for the alba version, there have been cases where it's known to have 3 flowers per stem. So it's a very rewarding and fast-growing species that would be great for any Paphiopedilum lover. The foliage on these plants are also really quite stunning. I really like the kind of tessellation and veining on these plants. It has a great contrast between the dark green and the white, so I find it really fascinating. It also has this red tinge spotting on the underside of the leaves and on the side of the stem, which just makes it a very beautiful foliage plant. Even when it's not in bloom, it's a great plant to have. The Paphiopedilum delenatii is a very interesting plant. For the longest time, it was considered extinct in the wild. So from 1915, I think, was when it was first ID'd. Several years later, the local population was decimated, so it was considered extinct from about the 1920s all the way up until the 1980s, when it was rediscovered, and they found them in 2 locations. They ended up trying to conserve the plant, so that whole period in between, in the United States, there was only 1 plant of the Paphiopedilum delenatii that was propagated. So they thought that the Paphiopedilum delenatii was actually hard to grow because it was considered fairly weak and slow growing, and because of all the inbreeding that it had, it was just not a very great plant. In the 80s and 90s, when they rediscovered this plant in the wild, they greatly increased the genetic diversity of the delenatii. And now it's considered one of the easier growing species because of the strength of its native population. There's a lot more genetic diversity in the new plants these days, and they are just growing faster and stronger than any of the old previous plants. So I thought that was kind of interesting how it was a plant that was considered to be extinct in the wild, but now it is no longer. Not only that, but there are a couple different varieties so that you can see kind of the diversity of this species in and of itself. So that's what I wanted to share about the Paphiopedilum delenatii. If you're interested in the carecollab series, please check Nina and Fernanda for their updates on the Paphiopedilum delenatii and how they care for it. If you're interested in more Paphiopedilums, please click on the playlist to follow along, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye!